It was a sound that happens millions of times a day across America. A finger presses a plastic button, a buzzer rings, a door opens. It is usually the sound of a pizza delivery, a visiting friend, or a neighbor. But at 11:15 a.m. on July 18th, 1989, at a modest apartment in West Hollywood, that sound was the trigger of a loaded gun. On the inside stood Rebecca Schaeffer, a 21-year-old symbol of Hollywood innocence, rushing to the door expecting a script that would launch her movie career. On the outside stood a man with a .357 Magnum and a blurred line between love and murder. When Rebecca opened that door, she didn't just lose her life. She opened a Pandora's box that would change the law, destroy the illusion of privacy, and force every celebrity in the world to hide behind a gate. This is the story of how a single ring of a doorbell ended a life and silenced the innocence of an entire generation. Rebecca was not a product of the Los Angeles star-making factory. She was born and raised in Eugene, Oregon, a place known for its counterculture spirit, its rain-soaked greenery, and its intellectual grounding. She was the only child of a psychologist and a writer, Benson and Dana Schaeffer, and this pedigree mattered. She didn't grow up in a household where fame was the currency of value. She grew up in a home filled with books, debates, and a deep connection to her Jewish heritage. She was raised to be critical, to be kind, and above all, to be authentic. When she eventually left Oregon to pursue her dreams, first to New York and then to Los Angeles, she carried that grounding with her like a protective amulet. In a town of shapeshifters, Rebecca Schaeffer remained stubbornly herself. She was the type of young woman who would quote literature in interviews rather than gossip, who attended synagogue not for the photo opportunity, but for the spiritual connection, and who treated the business of acting not as a desperate claw for validation, but as a craft to be respected. Her breakthrough came in 1986, and it happened with the kind of speed that Hollywood legends are made of. The show was My Sister Sam, a sitcom vehicle designed for Pam Dauber, who was already television royalty from her days on Mork and Mindy. The network needed a spark, a foil, someone to play Patty Russell, the teenage sister who crashes into the protagonist's life. The casting director saw hundreds of girls. They saw the polished professionals, the desperate hopefuls, the beauty queens, and then walked in Rebecca. Pam Dauber would later recall that the chemistry was instantaneous. It wasn't something that could be manufactured or directed. It was a biological fact. They just clicked. Rebecca didn't have to pretend to be the energetic, slightly wide-eyed newcomer. She was that person. She brought a kinetic energy to the set that was infectious. When the show aired, she didn't just support the lead. In many scenes, she stole the show. America fell in love with Patty Russell, and by extension, they fell in love with Rebecca Schaeffer. But this success, rapid and dazzling as it was, created a dangerous optical illusion. To the audience, Rebecca was Patty. She was the bubbly teenager living in a cool San Francisco apartment, dealing with boys and homework. The reality was that Rebecca was a young adult woman living alone in West Hollywood, navigating the complex and often lonely transition into adulthood. The industry, however, encouraged the blurring of these lines. Teen magazines like 17 and Tiger Beat plastered her face on their covers, selling her image as the ultimate confidant. "Write to Rebecca," the captions would urge. "She wants to hear from you." And they did write. Thousands of letters poured in from all corners of the country. They wrote to her about their crushes, their failed exams, their loneliness. And here is where the story begins to pivot from a success narrative to a tragedy of errors. In the 1980s, the infrastructure of celebrity security was practically non-existent for television actors. If you were Michael Jackson or Madonna, perhaps you had bodyguards. But if you were a sitcom star, you were considered a civilian with a high-profile job. There were no threat assessment teams analyzing fan mail for markers of schizophrenia or obsession. There were no background checks on the people who sent gifts. The prevailing wisdom was that fans were harmless. They were the people who paid the bills. To fear them was considered paranoid, even ungrateful. Rebecca, with her Oregon upbringing and her inherent trust in the goodness of people, subscribed to this philosophy entirely. She didn't just tolerate her fans, she engaged with them. She didn't use a ghostwriting service to churn out generic replies. She would often sit on the floor of her apartment surrounded by stacks of envelopes and handwrite responses on personalized stationery. It was an act of profound kindness. She believed that if someone took the time to share their soul with her, they deserved a human response. She didn't know. She couldn't have known that among the thousands of innocent letters from teenage girls, there were messages ticking like time bombs sent by minds that did not understand the concept of boundaries. This openness extended to her physical life as well. Rebecca lived at 120 North Sweetser Avenue. It was a charming Tudor-style apartment building in a quiet, residential pocket of West Hollywood. It wasn't a fortress. It didn't have a doorman. It didn't have a gate with a security code. It was the kind of building where you could walk right up to the front entrance from the sidewalk. The front door was glass. The intercom system was analog and accessible to anyone passing by. But the most chilling detail, the one that makes you want to reach back through time and scream a warning, was the mailbox. In the lobby of the building, like millions of other apartment buildings in America, there was a row of metal mailboxes. And on one of them, typed on a small label, was the name R. Schaeffer. It seems inconceivable to us now. Today, a celebrity of her stature would live behind 3 layers of security under an LLC with a pseudonym on every document. But in 1989, this was normal. It was normal to be famous and to have your name on your mailbox. It was normal to drive your own car to the grocery store. It was normal to answer your own front door. This normalcy was the camouflage that danger wore. The city of Los Angeles itself conspired to maintain this illusion. For decades, the city had sold itself on the premise of access. Maps to the stars' homes were sold on street corners in Beverly Hills for a few dollars. Tour buses drove past the driveways of legends, and tourists would wave, hoping to catch a glimpse of a gardener or a maid, satisfying themselves with the proximity to fame. The culture treated privacy not as a right, but as something you surrendered the moment you signed a contract. The logic was perverse but pervasive. You wanted to be famous, didn't you? You wanted the applause, the money, the covers of magazines. Then you belong to the public. You are public property. Rebecca was transitioning out of this phase of teen idolatry, and that transition made her even more vulnerable. By the summer of 1989, My Sister Sam had been canceled. This is a crucial psychological juncture for any young actor. The safety net of a weekly schedule is gone. The family of the cast and crew disperses. You are suddenly alone again, auditioning, fighting for your place in an industry that has a notoriously short memory. Rebecca was determined to be taken seriously. She didn't want to be the cute kid sister forever. She was reading scripts for feature films, looking for roles with grit, with substance. She was shedding the skin of the child star, a process that is difficult enough without the added pressure of a hidden predator watching your every move. She was 21 years old. It is a fragile age. You are legally an adult, but you are still forming the calluses that protect you from the world. Rebecca hadn't formed those calluses yet. She was still soft, still open, still radiating that dangerous luminosity that drew people in. Her friends and colleagues from that time remember her as being on the cusp of something great. There was a sense of momentum building around her. She was dating Brad Silberling, a young director, and their relationship was serious, grounding her in a reality outside of the sound stages. She had plans, she had ambitions. She was going to auditions for major directors. The morning of July 18th was supposed to be a stepping stone, a pivot point toward that serious future. The script for The Godfather Part 3 was not just a stack of paper, it was a symbol of her graduation. Francis Ford Coppola was the heavyweight champion of cinema. To be considered by him was to be anointed. Rebecca was ready. She had the talent. She had the drive. She had everything going for her except the knowledge that the rules of the game had changed without anyone telling her. The era of open doors was not just about unlocked apartments, it was about unlocked minds. It was a psychological state where the default assumption was safety. When the buzzer rang at her apartment, Rebecca's brain didn't cycle through a threat assessment checklist. She didn't think, who could this be? Is it safe? She thought, that must be the script. Or, that must be a delivery. The neural pathways of fear had not yet been carved into the collective consciousness of Hollywood. We have to understand this. To understand why she opened the door, we cannot judge her by the paranoid standards of the 21st century. In her world, the buzzer was a promise, not a threat. It was a signal that the world was bringing her something, a script, a pizza, a friend. The idea that the world would bring her a bullet was so foreign, so violative of the social contract, that it likely never entered her mind until the moment the gun was raised. Meanwhile, in Tucson, Arizona, 19-year-old Robert John Bardo was living a life of isolation and obsession. He was not a monster born from a vacuum. He was a tragedy of biology and environment, fermented in neglect. Born into a large family, the youngest of 7 children, Bardo's entry into the world was marked by instability. His father was a non-commissioned officer in the Air Force, a man described in later court documents as rigid and emotionally distant. His mother, a Korean immigrant, struggled with her own demons. The Bardo household was a chaotic ecosystem of transients, moving from base to base, from Okinawa to California to Arizona, never staying in one place long enough for roots to take hold. But the instability wasn't just geographical, it was genetic. The family tree was gnarled with a history of severe mental illness. One of Bardo's brothers had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Another had committed suicide. The genetic dice had been rolled, and Robert had been handed a loaded legacy before he even took his first breath. As a child, Robert was the classic outcast. He was bright, his teachers noted a high intelligence, but he was socially crippled. He didn't understand the unwritten rules of the playground. He couldn't navigate the complex hierarchies of teenage friendship. While other boys were playing sports or learning to drive, Robert was retreating. He built a fortress of solitude around himself brick by brick. By the time he reached adolescence, the fortress was complete, and he was the sole inhabitant. He dropped out of high school, unable to cope with the sensory overload and the social rejection. He took a job as a janitor at a Jack in the Box, a role that suited his invisibility. He spent his days pushing a mop, watching the world through the grease-stained windows of a fast food joint, existing in the margins of society. But when the shift ended, he went home to his real life. His real life was lived inside the glowing rectangle of a television set. For Robert Bardo, television was not entertainment. It was not a distraction. It was a lifeline. It was a window into a world that made sense. A world where conflicts were resolved with a laugh track, where families loved each other, and where beautiful, kind people lived happy lives. He didn't just watch these shows. He studied them. He absorbed them. And in the vacuum of his own social isolation, he began to form parasocial relationships that were terrifyingly intense. He didn't have friends in Tucson, but he had friends on the screen. He didn't have a girlfriend, but he had objects of worship that he could visit every week at the same time on the same channel. The screen was a mirror, but instead of reflecting his own sad, lonely face, it reflected the person he wanted to be with. Before there was Rebecca, there was Samantha. In the mid-1980s, Bardo became fixated on Samantha Smith, the young American schoolgirl who had become famous as a peace activist after writing a letter to the Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. She was a symbol of hope, of purity, of the power of innocence, themes that would echo tragically later in his life. Bardo tracked her every move. He went to Maine, where she lived, searching for her. He was stopped by police, not for stalking a crime that didn't technically exist, but for being a suspicious wandering vagrant. He was sent home. When Samantha Smith died in a plane crash in 1985, Bardo was devastated, but his grief was not the normal sadness of a fan. It was the despair of a widower. The vacancy in his heart was vast and howling. He needed to fill it. He needed a new vessel for his devotion. The mechanism of his obsession was like a heat-seeking missile. It required a target to lock onto, and without one, it spun wildly out of control. Then in 1986, the static cleared, and he saw My Sister Sam. It is almost too poetic, too cruel a coincidence, that the show's title contained the name of his dead idol. But what captured Bardo wasn't the title, it was the girl. When Rebecca Schaeffer walked onto the screen as Patty Russell, something clicked in the dark machinery of Bardo's mind. She was everything he needed her to be. She was beautiful, yes, with her dark curls and her luminous eyes, but she was also accessible. Her character was spunky, vulnerable, and approachable. She wasn't an icy blonde Hitchcock heroine. She was the girl who could understand him. In his delusions, Bardo didn't see an actress performing a job. He saw a soulmate signaling to him through the airwaves. He believed, with the fervor of a religious zealot, that her performances were not for the millions of viewers watching CBS. They were coded messages meant specifically for him. When she looked into the camera, she was looking at him. When she smiled, she was smiling at him. This is the hallmark of erotomania, a psychiatric condition where the sufferer holds a delusional belief that another person, usually of higher social status, is in love with them. It is a tragedy of misinterpretation. Every silence is interpreted as a secret longing. Every public appearance is seen as a rendezvous. For Bardo, the distance between Tucson and Hollywood wasn't a barrier. It was merely a test of their bond. He began to write. The letters Robert Bardo wrote to Rebecca Schaeffer were not the scribbles of a casual fan. They were heavy, dense outpourings of a soul in turmoil. He wrote to her about his life, his pain, his loneliness. He wrote songs for her, lyrics that were likely clumsy and raw, trying to express a love that had no basis in reality. He didn't threaten her not yet. In the early stages, his obsession was painted in the colors of adoration. He wanted to save her, and in return, he wanted her to save him. He projected onto her a fragility that mirrored his own. He saw her as a wholly innocent, a pure being in a corrupt world. This narrative of innocence is crucial to understanding the violence that followed. Bardo didn't just love Rebecca. He worshipped a specific crystallized version of her. He worshipped the idea of her innocence. He placed her on a pedestal so high that she ceased to be a human being capable of autonomy or flaws. She became an idol, a statue of the Virgin Mary made of flesh and blood, and his self-appointed role was that of the guardian at the gate. But worship is a demanding master. It requires acknowledgement. Bardo sent letter after letter, pouring his essence into envelopes, sending them into the void and waiting. The waiting in Tucson must have been agonizing. Picture him in his small, cluttered room, the television casting a blue, flickering light on his face, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, waiting for the mailman. Every day that passed without a reply coiled the spring of his tension a little tighter. He began to feel that the world was keeping them apart. His family, absorbed in their own dysfunctions, missed the signs, or perhaps they saw them and simply didn't know what to do. In the 1980s, mental health intervention was often reactive, not proactive. A quiet boy writing letters to a TV star wasn't a crisis, it was just a hobby. No one checked the content of the letters. No one asked why he was spending his meager paycheck on stamps and stationery. No one looked into his eyes and saw the gathering storm. There were moments of friction, warning shots that went unheard. Bardo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was hospitalized briefly for emotional problems, a stint in a mental health facility that should have been a red flag. But the system was a revolving door. He was stabilized, perhaps medicated for a short time, and then released back into the wild, back to the solitude of his room and the company of his obsession. The diagnosis was there. He was troubled. He was unstable, but the bridge between troubled and dangerous had not yet been built in the eyes of the law. He was an adult. He hadn't committed a crime. He was free to cultivate his garden of delusions. The shift in Bardo's mind from admirer to stalker was gradual, insidious, and terrifyingly logical within his own framework. If she was his soulmate, then he had to be with her. It wasn't enough to watch her. He had to breathe the same air. The letters were a bridge, but he needed to cross it physically. He began to plan trips to Los Angeles. This wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. He saved his money from the janitorial job, counting out the dollars that would buy him a bus ticket to the promised land. He bought a map of Los Angeles. He studied it with the intensity of a general planning an invasion. He didn't know where she lived yet, but he knew where she worked. Warner Brothers Studios. That was the temple. That was where she existed. It is chilling to realize that while Rebecca was laughing on set, filming scenes about prom dates and sisterly squabbles, Bardo was in Tucson, sitting in the dark, refining his narrative. He was convincing himself that she was waiting for him. He believed that if he could just stand in front of her, if she could just see him, the facade would drop. She would recognize him. The TV star persona would melt away, and they would be just Robert and Rebecca, two lost souls finding each other in the chaos of the universe. He was unaware of the cruelty of his own mind. He was unaware that he was writing a script that could only end in blood. He was simply a lonely boy in the desert, driven by a hunger that no amount of fan mail could satisfy. In the grand, chaotic tapestry of cause and effect, it is often the smallest, most benevolent gestures that cast the longest shadows. If hatred is a loud, crashing wave, then tragedy is often a silent undertow, pulling us under when we think we are swimming in calm waters. For Rebecca Schaeffer, the undertow began with a simple act of gratitude. It began with a piece of stationery, a pen, and a few sentences of polite appreciation that were meant to brighten a fan's day, but instead signed a death warrant. The volume of mail that arrived for Rebecca in 1987 was overwhelming. It came in sacks, a deluge of adoration from teenage girls who wanted her hair, teenage boys who wanted her heart, and grandmothers who wanted to bake her cookies. Handling this avalanche was a logistical challenge. Like many stars of her caliber, Rebecca utilized a fan mail service, a team of assistants whose job it was to sift through the mountains of paper, sort the requests, and send out the standard 8x10 glossy photos signed with a pre-printed autograph. But Rebecca was different. She insisted on a personal touch. She believed that the connection with her audience was sacred. Occasionally, A letter would stand out perhaps for its sincerity, perhaps for its vulnerability, and it would receive a direct reply. Somewhere in that pile was a letter from Tucson, Arizona. It was written by Robert John Bardo. It was not a threatening manifesto. It was, by all accounts, a sensitive, if slightly intense expression of admiration. He wrote about how much her character meant to him, how she was a light in his dark world. In the context of 1987, it was indistinguishable from thousands of other letters sent by lonely young men. It didn't raise any red flags because the red flags of stalking had not yet been codified in the Manual of Celebrity Management. The reply that was sent back to Bardo was brief. It was polite. It was fatally kind. "Your letter was one of the nicest I received," the note read. It was likely signed by an assistant, or perhaps by Rebecca herself in a hurried moment between takes. To the sender, it was a throwaway line, a standard pleasantry used to make a fan feel special. But language is subjective. To a rational mind, nicest means pleasant, agreeable. To the starving, delusional mind of Robert John Bardo, nicest was a superlative that elevated him above the rest of humanity. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a validation of his existence. It was proof in his distorted reality that the connection was mutual. She didn't just read his letter, she felt it. She singled him out. The nice boy from Tucson was no longer invisible. He had been seen by the goddess, and she had smiled upon him. That piece of paper became a holy relic. Bardo carried it with him. He read it until the creases were worn deep, until the ink was etched into his memory. But the validation brought with it a terrible new hunger. A letter was no longer enough. If she thought he was nice, then surely she would want to meet him. Surely if he presented himself to her, the barriers of distance and fame would dissolve, and they would recognize each other as kindred spirits. The logic was watertight in the closed loop of his psychosis. In June of 1987, the ghost left the desert. Bardo liquidated his meager savings and boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Burbank, California. He was carrying a large teddy bear and a bouquet of flowers, the cliché armaments of a courtship that existed only in his head. The bus ride was long and grueling, a journey through the scorching Mojave. But Bardo was propelled by a singular purpose. He wasn't going to visit a set, he was going to visit a friend. He arrived at the Warner Brothers lot, a sprawling city within a city where dreams were manufactured on an industrial scale. The studio was a fortress of sorts, surrounded by high walls and guarded by men in uniforms whose job was to keep the fantasy contained. Bardo approached the main gate. He must have looked a sight. A disheveled, awkward teenager clutching a teddy bear in the bright California sun, asking to see the star of My Sister Sam. The security guards at Warner Brothers were accustomed to this. Every day, tourists, drifters, and hopefuls washed up at their gates like debris. They had a script for this, just as the actors inside had theirs. They told him firmly but politely that he couldn't enter. They told him that Miss Schaeffer was working and could not be disturbed. They told him to leave the gifts and they would see that she got them. For Bardo, this was a catastrophic dissonance. This wasn't how the script in his head was supposed to go. He tried to explain. He tried to tell them about the letter, about the connection, about how she knew him. But to the guards, he was just another fan who didn't understand the rules. They didn't see a predator. They saw a pest. They didn't see a future murderer. They saw a lovesick kid who needed to go home. They turned him away. Bardo retreated, but he didn't leave. He lingered in the perimeter of the studio, a satellite orbiting a planet he couldn't land on. The rejection didn't break his delusion, it only bruised it. He returned to Tucson, the teddy bear likely discarded in a dumpster or carried back as a symbol of his failure. But the failure wasn't interpreted as a lack of interest from Rebecca. It was interpreted as the interference of the system. The guards, the studio, the handlers, they were the enemies keeping the lovers apart. A month later, Bardo returned. This second visit in July of 1987 is the moment where the timeline fractures, the moment where history holds its breath and screams for intervention. This time, the teddy bear was gone. This time, the flowers were gone. When Bardo approached the Warner Brothers gate for the second time, he was carrying a knife. The mood had shifted. The nice boy was fraying at the edges. He was desperate. He demanded to see her. The specific details of this encounter are chilling in their banality. He managed to get close enough to the entrance to be considered a nuisance. Security was called again. They confronted him. They searched Highmore, perhaps. He revealed the weapon, or perhaps it remained hidden, but his demeanor was threatening enough to warrant escalation. The accounts vary on the exact mechanics, but the outcome is a matter of record. They stopped him. They assessed him. And then they let him go. Bardo returned to Tucson again, but something had changed. The rejection at the gate had calcified his obsession. The nice phase was ending. The era of the teddy bear was over. He sank back into his life of mopping floors and watching television. But the resentment was growing. He began to feel that he was being mocked. The silence from Hollywood was no longer a pause. It was an insult. And as the months turned into years, as My Sister Sam was canceled and Rebecca moved on with her life, Bardo remained frozen in that summer of 1987, nursing the wound of his rejection, waiting for a sign that would justify his anger. He drifted. He traveled. He went to New York for a while, aimless, before returning to the desert. The obsession went dormant, like a virus hiding in the nerve endings, waiting for a trigger to reactivate it. He needed a new spark. He needed a reason to escalate from fan to executioner. That spark would not come from a letter or a rejection at a gate. It would come from the screen itself. It would come in 1989 when Rebecca Schaeffer made the brave artistic choice to take a role in a film called Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. She made the choice to grow up, and in the dark, twisted theater of Robert Bardo's mind, that act of growing up was the ultimate betrayal. The fatal contact had been made. The letter had been sent. The gate had been breached. The system had blinked. And now the countdown to the final act had begun. By 1989, Rebecca Schaeffer was fighting a war that every young actor in Hollywood eventually faces, the war against her own image. The industry loves a typecast. To the executives at the studios and the casting agents flipping through headshots, she was Patty Russell, the bubbly, wholesome, non-threatening teenager from My Sister Sam. She was the TV sweetheart, a label that is both a compliment and a cage. But Rebecca was 21 years old. She was intelligent, ambitious, and hungry for material that reflected the complexity of the adult world. She didn't want to play the kid sister forever. She wanted to be an artist. This drive led her to audition for a film called Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. Directed by Paul Bartel, it was a dark, satirical sex comedy, a far cry from the laugh-track innocence of primetime CBS. It was an indie film, sophisticated, cynical, and decidedly adult. Rebecca landed a supporting role. For her, it was a triumph. It was a declaration of independence. It was proof that she could handle material that required nuance and maturity. In the film, there is a scene where her character appears in bed with a male actor. By the standards of 1989 cinema, and certainly by modern standards, it was tame. There was no nudity. It was suggested intimacy, a narrative device to advance the plot of a farce. It was acting. But in Tucson, Arizona, Robert John Bardo was not watching a film. He was watching a betrayal. When Bardo viewed scenes from the class struggle in Beverly Hills, the delicate, crystallized fantasy he had constructed over 3 years shattered instantly. The holy innocent he had worshipped, the Virgin Mary of the airwaves, had been defiled. In his fractured psychology, Rebecca Schaeffer was not a woman doing a job. She was his spiritual property, and she had just committed adultery. The mechanism of his erotomania inverted violently. The intense love he felt, or what he codified as love, curdled into an equally intense, righteous hatred. He later told psychiatrists that seeing that scene made him realize she was just another Hollywood whore. This phrase is crucial. It reveals the binary nature of the stalker's mind. The object of obsession is either an angel or a demon. There is no middle ground for humanity. By engaging in an adult role, by showing sexuality, Rebecca had broken the contract Bardo had written in his head. She had lost her innocence, and in doing so, she had robbed him of the purity he depended on to survive his own miserable existence. If she wasn't innocent, she was guilty. And if she was guilty, she had to be punished. The decision was made. The rescue mission was canceled. The execution was authorized. Bardo began to prepare for his final trip to Los Angeles, but this time he needed more than a teddy bear or a knife. He needed a tool that matched the finality of his intent. He needed a gun. In 1989, gun laws in Arizona were loose, but there were still hurdles for a 19-year-old with a documented history of mental institutionalization. Bardo knew that if he walked into a gun store and filled out the federal paperwork himself, he might be flagged, or at least he feared he might be. He couldn't risk a denial. He needed a straw purchaser. He turned to his older brother, Edward. The dynamic between the brothers is a tragic footnote in this saga. Edward knew Robert was troubled. He knew Robert was obsessed, but he didn't know the depth of the darkness. Robert told his brother he needed a gun for protection, for target practice, the standard lies of the desperate. Edward, perhaps worn down by Robert's persistence, or perhaps simply not understanding the gravity of the request, agreed. They went to a gun shop in Tucson. Edward filled out the form 4473. He underwent the background check, he paid the money, and then he handed Robert a Ruger GP 100.357 Magnum. This weapon choice is significant. A .357 Magnum is not a small, concealable holdout pistol. It is a heavy, long-barreled revolver designed for stopping power. It is a weapon of war and law enforcement. It is loud, it is heavy, and it is devastating. When Robert Bardo held that gun, the balance of power shifted. He was no longer the skinny, invisible janitor who scrubbed grease off the floor. He was the hand of God. He had the power to correct the mistake that Rebecca Schaeffer had made. He had the power to stop the loss of innocence by freezing her in time forever. He bought ammunition. He bought a holster. He packed his bag. He included a copy of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. This detail has often been sensationalized, linking him to Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon. Bardo carried a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a chilling echo of Mark David Chapman. In his distorted mind, he wasn't a murderer, but a catcher, stopping Rebecca from falling into what he saw as the phoniness of adulthood. He was ready. He had the weapon. He had the motive. He had the rage. But he still lacked the one thing that mattered most, the coordinates. He knew she was in Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is 500 square miles of haystack, and she was the needle. He needed a map. How much is a human life worth? In spiritual terms, it is infinite. In legal terms, it is incalculable. But in bureaucratic terms, in the summer of 1989, the location of Rebecca Schaeffer's life was worth exactly $250 Robert Bardo knew he couldn't just wander around Hollywood hoping to bump into her. He had tried that at the studio gates, and it had failed. He needed precision. He needed her sanctuary. In June 1989, Bardo walked into a private investigation agency in Tucson. It was a small, nondescript office, the kind of place that handles divorce cases, insurance fraud, and missing persons. He sat down across from a private investigator named Anthony Flores. Bardo spun a lie. It was a flimsy, pathetic story. He told Flores that he was an old friend of Rebecca Schaeffer's from back in the day, that they had lost touch, and he wanted to send her a nice gift. He didn't look like an old friend of a Hollywood star. He looked like exactly what he was, a disheveled, intense drifter. But the private investigation industry is not the morality police. It is a service industry. Flores took the job. He told Bardo the fee would be $250. Bardo paid it. What happened next is the single most infuriating administrative failure in the history of modern privacy. Flores did not conduct a stakeout. He did not hack into a computer mainframe. He did not bribe a studio executive. He simply utilized the tools that the state of California provided to anyone with a checkbook. At that time, the California Department of Motor Vehicles operated under the principle that driver's license information was public record. The logic was archaic, rooted in a time when knowing who owned a car was necessary for liability and commerce. But the state had turned this data into a revenue stream. They sold lists to direct marketers, to insurance companies, and to private investigators. Flores initiated a request. He likely contacted a colleague in California or filled out a form himself. He provided Rebecca Schaeffer's name and date of birth information easily available in fan magazines. He paid a nominal fee to the state, likely less than $5. The DMV computer whirred. It searched its database. It found the match. And then, without asking why, without asking who wanted to know, without alerting Rebecca Schaeffer, the state of California printed out her home address, 120 North Sweetser Avenue, Apartment 4, West Hollywood, CA 90048. The printout was mailed to Flores. Flores called Bardo. "I have it," he likely said. Bardo returned to the office. He was handed a slip of paper. Pause for a moment and consider the weight of that transaction. The state government, the entity sworn to protect its citizens, had just sold the keys to Rebecca Schaeffer's castle to her assassin. They didn't do it out of malice. They did it out of indifference. They did it because privacy was not considered a right. It was considered an obstacle to the free flow of information. Bardo held the paper. The mystery was solved. The Hollywood goddess was no longer floating in the ether of television signals. She was pinned down to a specific street, a specific building number, a specific apartment. She was real. And because she was real, she was reachable. This was the final tumbler in the lock. If the DMV records had been privateers, they are today, Bardo would have been stuck in Tucson. He might have gone to Los Angeles, wandered the streets, and eventually run out of money. He might have returned to the studio gates and been arrested, but the address gave him a destination. It gave his chaotic plan a geometric certainty. Bardo went home to his room. He looked at the map of Los Angeles. He found Fairfax Avenue. He found Sweetser Avenue. He traced the route with his finger. It was a short walk from the bus stops. It was a quiet neighborhood. He packed the .357 Magnum. He packed the hollow point bullets. He packed the address. He told his family he was going on another trip. They didn't stop him. Why would they? He was an adult. He boarded the Greyhound bus one last time. The wheels hummed against the asphalt, carrying him west through the desert night. Every mile brought him closer to the door that Rebecca Schaeffer was currently unlocking to let herself in after a long day. She was sleeping in her bed, safe, unaware that her address was burning a hole in the pocket of a man sitting in row 4 of a bus crossing the state line. The system had failed her at the studio gate. The mental health system had failed to treat the man coming for her. And now the bureaucratic state had failed her by selling her coordinates. All the layers of protection that civilization is supposed to provide had been stripped away, one by one, until there was nothing left but a wooden door and a glass pane between the girl and the gun. Robert John Bardo arrived in Los Angeles on the morning of July 18th. He stepped off the bus into the smoggy, bright morning of the City of Angels. He asked a stranger for directions to West Hollywood. He began to walk. The price of Rebecca Schaeffer's life had been paid. The receipt was in his pocket, and he was coming to collect. Tuesday, July 18th, 1989, dawned with the hazy golden promise typical of a Los Angeles summer. In the Fairfax district of West Hollywood, the streets were waking up. It was a neighborhood in transition, a mix of elderly Jewish retirees and young, up-and-coming creatives. The architecture was a nostalgic blend of 1920 Spanish Revival and English Tudor apartment blocks, buildings that sat close to the sidewalk, inviting and open. At 120 North Sweetser Avenue, the morning routine was underway. Inside apartment 4, Rebecca Schaeffer was beginning what she believed would be the most important day of her career. The apartment reflected her personality. It wasn't the sterile, professionally decorated fortress of a superstar. It was the home of a 21-year-old woman figuring out her style. There were books, scripts, and the comfortable clutter of a creative life. Rebecca was dressed casually in a robe, her hair likely unstyled, her face fresh and devoid of makeup. She was pacing, checking the clock, checking the window. She was waiting for a courier. The script for The Godfather Part 3 was en route. Francis Ford Coppola was casting the role of Mary Corleone, the daughter of Al Pacino's character. It was the role that every young actress in Hollywood would have killed for. For Rebecca, it was the validation she had been seeking ever since the cancellation of My Sister Sam. A callback for Coppola wasn't just an audition. It was a coronation. She had cleared her schedule. She was ready to study the lines the moment they arrived. Every sound from the street, a car door slamming, footsteps on the pavement, drew her attention. She was expecting a knock that would bring her future. While Rebecca waited inside, a very different figure was navigating the streets outside. He was wearing a yellow polo shirt that clashed with the grim determination on his face. He was carrying a red canvas bag. Inside the bag was the copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a cassette tape of U2's album The Joshua Tree, a signed publicity photo of Rebecca she had sent him years earlier, and the loaded Ruger .357 Magnum. Bardo was lost. Despite the address he had purchased, the streets of West Hollywood can be confusing to an outsider. He wandered the neighborhood, a spectral figure in the morning light. He asked passers-by for directions. People stopped, pointed, and helped him. This is a detail that chills the blood. People helped the assassin find his way because he looked harmless. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a confused tourist or a lost student. The banality of evil was on full display. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was walking in the sunshine, asking for help to find the woman he intended to kill. At approximately 10 a.m., Bardo found the building. He walked up the short path to the front entrance. He scanned the intercom panel. He saw the name R. Schaeffer. He pressed the buzzer. Inside, Rebecca's heart likely leapt. The script. It had to be the script. She went to the intercom. "Who is it?" she asked. Bardo didn't answer clearly, or perhaps he mumbled something. Rebecca, assuming it was the delivery she was desperate for, buzzed him into the main lobby. But Bardo didn't enter the lobby. He waited at the front door of the apartment unit itself. Rebecca opened her door. The confrontation that followed was anticlimactic in a way that only reality can be. It wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't a dramatic monologue. Rebecca stood in the doorway, likely surprised to see a stranger instead of a courier with a thick envelope. Bardo held up the letter she had written to him, the nicest letter and the signed photo. "I wrote this to you," he said, or words to that effect. Rebecca, ever the professional, ever the polite girl from Oregon, realized this was a fan who had found her home, a fan who had bypassed boundaries. But she didn't panic. She didn't slam the door. She smiled a tight, polite smile. "Oh, thank you," she said. She explained she was busy. She was preparing for an appointment. "Please take care," she told him. It was a dismissal, but it was a gentle one. She treated him with dignity. She didn't call the police. She didn't scream for help. She simply set a boundary. She closed the door. Bardo stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. He walked to a diner on the corner, a place called Jan's Restaurant. He sat down. The rage returned, colder and harder than before. He paid his bill. He picked up his red bag. He walked back to 120 North Sweetser Avenue. Inside the apartment, Rebecca was likely frustrated. The script still hadn't arrived. The interruption by the fan was unsettling, but she probably pushed it aside, focusing on the audition. When the buzzer rang a second time at 11:15 a.m., she moved with a sense of urgency. She assumed the courier had finally arrived, or perhaps the fan had returned, and she needed to be firmer this time. She walked to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt. She turned the knob. She opened the door. Robert Bardo was standing on the porch step. This time, there was no letter in his hand. The .357 Magnum was already drawn. He didn't speak. He didn't give her a chance to scream. He raised the weapon and fired a single shot at point-blank range. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hallway. The bullet struck Rebecca directly in the chest, piercing her heart. The impact was catastrophic. The force of the Magnum round threw her backward onto the floor of her apartment. Bardo stood over her for a fleeting second. According to his later confession, Rebecca, lying on the floor, shock rapidly setting in, looked up at him. She didn't curse him. She didn't beg for her life. She simply asked the question that echoed the absurdity of the entire situation. "Why?" she whispered. "Why?" It was the final utterance of a life defined by curiosity and kindness. Bardo turned and ran. He fled down the street, adrenaline coursing through him. In his panic, he hurled the copy of The Catcher in the Rye onto the roof of a nearby building, a literary tombstone left at the scene of the crime. He disappeared into the labyrinth of Los Angeles traffic, a ghost once again. Behind him in the open doorway of apartment 4, the silence returned. The phone began to ring inside the apartment. It rang and rang, but no one answered. The sound of a .357 Magnum is unmistakable. It is not like a car backfiring. It is a thunderclap that vibrates in the chest. Neighbors in the building heard the shot. 2 of them rushed to the hallway. They found Rebecca lying in the entryway, unconscious, her life ebbing away rapidly. One neighbor, Kenneth Starr, frantically called 911. "She's been shot! She's been shot!" he screamed. He tried to check her pulse. It was faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They worked desperately to stabilize her. They loaded her into the ambulance, the sirens wailing a mournful dirge as they tore through the streets toward Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. This was the hospital of the stars, the place where Hollywood usually went to heal. But the damage done by the hollow point bullet was too massive. At the hospital, doctors fought for 30 minutes to revive her, but the trauma to her heart and aorta was non-survivable. At 11:45 a.m. on July 18, 1989, Rebecca Schaeffer was pronounced dead. The news spread through Los Angeles like a seismic tremor. First, it hit the inner circle. Brad Silberling, her boyfriend, received the call that tears the world apart. He rushed to the hospital, but he was too late. He found himself in a sterile room, saying goodbye to the woman he had planned a future with. The grief was so raw, so physical, that it would later inspire him to write and direct the film Moonlight Mile, a meditation on loss and the absurdity of mourning. Then, the news reached the My Sister Sam family. Pam Dauber was at home when she heard. She collapsed. For Dauber, Rebecca wasn't a co-star. She was a surrogate sister, a young woman she had mentored and protected. The devastation was absolute. Dauber would later effectively retire from the industry, retreating to raise her family away from the spotlight, her view of fame permanently darkened by the blood on the doorstep. But as the afternoon wore on, the personal grief transformed into a collective terror that gripped the entire entertainment industry. In 1989, there was no internet, but the jungle drums of Hollywood were faster than fiber optics. Agents called clients, publicists called managers. The question on everyone's lips was not just who did this, but how did he find her? When the police confirmed that the shooter was an obsessed fan who had come to her home, a chill went down the spine of every actor in the city. The illusion of safety, the bubble that they all lived in, popped instantly. For decades, Hollywood stars had operated under a gentleman's agreement with the public. We perform for you, you love us, and when the cameras are off, we are allowed to be people. We go to the supermarket, we drive our cars, we live in houses with mailboxes. Rebecca's death shredded that agreement. It proved that love could mutate into murder, and that the distance between the screen and the living room was zero. Panic set in. Actors who had previously scoffed at security details suddenly hired round-the-clock guards. Fences that were decorative were reinforced with steel. The phone lines at security firms were jammed. But the true horror came a few days later when the details of the investigation began to leak. The LAPD detectives retracing Bardo's steps discovered the private investigator in Tucson. They discovered the transaction. They discovered the source. The killer didn't tail her from the studio. He didn't hack a phone line. He paid the state of California $5 for her address. This revelation turned the sadness into fury. The industry realized that they weren't just vulnerable to crazy people. They were being betrayed by their own government. Every driver's license in their wallets was a potential death warrant. The shockwave wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Screen Actors Guild mobilized. The anger was palpable. How many other addresses had been sold? Who else was on a list? In the days following the murder, the flowers piled up outside 120 North Sweetser Avenue. Fans wept. The media descended. But inside the gated estates of Beverly Hills and Bel Air, the lights stayed on all night. The party was over. The 1980s, the decade of excess and optimism, effectively ended on that doorstep. Rebecca Schaeffer was the first. She was the canary in the coal mine. Her death signaled the arrival of a darker, predatory age of celebrity culture. The era of the open door was officially closed, sealed with police tape. And as the initial shock began to fade, a new resolve began to harden, a resolve to ensure that no one else would ever be bought and sold so cheaply again. The legal battle was about to begin. The manhunt for Robert John Bardo was short, bizarre, and disturbing, a fitting epilogue to his chaotic journey. After pulling the trigger, Bardo didn't disappear into the criminal underworld. He didn't have a safe house or a getaway driver. He fled back to the only place he knew, Tucson. The day after the murder, motorists on a busy freeway in Arizona reported a man running erratically through traffic, dodging cars, seemingly oblivious to the danger. When the highway patrol officers apprehended him, he wasn't armed. and he wasn't fighting. He was disoriented, murmuring to himself, a man whose internal circuitry had finally fused completely. He reportedly told the officers immediately, almost as a point of pride, "I killed Rebecca Schaeffer." The extradition to Los Angeles was swift. The media circus that awaited him was unprecedented. The stalker had a face, and it was the face of a shaggy-haired, dead-eyed boy who looked more like a confused fan at a rock concert than a cold-blooded assassin. But as the legal machinery began to turn, the image of the confused boy was systematically dismantled by a prosecutor who would soon become a household name herself, Marcia Clark. Years before she would stand in the center of the O.J. Simpson storm, Marcia Clark was the lead prosecutor assigned to the Rebecca Schaeffer case. She was sharp, aggressive, and deeply empathetic to the victim. Her strategy was clear. She needed to prove that Robert Bardo was not a helpless victim of schizophrenia who didn't know right from wrong. She had to prove that he was a calculated predator who had hunted his prey with patience and precision. The trial, which took place in 1991, was a bench trial, meaning Bardo's defense team, led by public defender Stephen Galindo, waived the right to a jury. They likely feared that a jury of ordinary Angelenos, horrified by the murder of a beloved TV star, would demand the death penalty out of pure emotion. Instead, the verdict would rest in the hands of Superior Court Judge Dino Folgoni. The defense's case rested entirely on the plea of insanity. They painted a portrait of a young man besieged by demons, a man whose mind was so fractured by mental illness that he could not form specific intent. They argued that he was driven by delusional messages, by the lyrics of the U2 song Exit, which Bardo claimed had commanded him to act. They brought in psychiatrists to testify about his history of institutionalization, his family's legacy of mental disorder, and his fragile grip on reality. It was a compelling narrative. Bardo was sick, not evil. But Marcia Clark dismantled this narrative with one undeniable weapon, the timeline. Insanity, in the legal sense, implies a lack of understanding of consequences. Clark argued that a man who doesn't know right from wrong does not hire a private investigator. A chaotic mind does not navigate the bureaucracy of the Department of Motor Vehicles. A man in the throes of a psychotic break does not have the presence of mind to ask his brother to buy a gun because he knows he can't pass the background check himself. Clark laid out the steps Bardo took: the purchase of the .357 Magnum, the hollow point bullets, the travel arrangements, the map reading, the breakfast he ate calmly between the first and second visit to Rebecca's door. Clark painted a picture not of a man possessed, but of a narcissist enraged. She argued that Bardo killed Rebecca not because voices told him to, but because he wanted to punish her for being arrogant, for being sexual, for growing up. It was a crime of ego. It was a crime of ownership. In one of the most chilling moments of the proceedings, the court examined the confrontation. Bardo admitted that after he shot her, as she lay dying and asking why, he simply walked away. He didn't call for help. He didn't stay to comfort her. He disposed of the book and the shirt. These were the actions of a man covering his tracks, a man fully aware that he had committed a crime. In October 1991, Judge Folgoni delivered his verdict. He acknowledged Bardo's mental illness. It was impossible to deny that Bardo was disturbed. But, the judge ruled, being mentally ill does not automatically mean you are legally insane. The planning, the travel, the acquisition of the weapon all pointed to a sophisticated, goal-oriented mindset. Bardo had stalked Rebecca Schaeffer. He had laid a trap. He had executed her. Robert John Bardo was convicted of murder in the first degree. The special circumstance of lying in wait was attached to the verdict, a legal enhancement that ensured he would never walk free again. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Bardo was led away, disconnected, and seemingly unmoved by the sentence, the courtroom felt a sense of relief, but not closure. Putting Bardo in a cell solved the problem of Robert Bardo, but it didn't solve the problem of the open door. It didn't solve the fact that for $250, anyone could still buy a celebrity's address. It didn't solve the fact that stalking was still not technically a crime in America. The trial was over, but the revolution was just beginning. Rebecca Schaeffer's death did what thousands of other crimes failed to do. It terrified the people who make the laws. When a politician or a powerful Hollywood donor realized that their own home address was available at the DMV for the price of a sandwich, the legislative gears began to grind with unprecedented speed. The first battleground was the definition of the crime itself. Before 1989, police officers were handcuffed by the penal code. If a woman called the station and said, "Ray, there is a man standing across the street watching my house every night," the police response was typically, "Has he attacked you? Has he broken in?" If the answer was no, there was nothing they could do. Loitering was a minor infraction. Harassment was hard to prove. The law required a physical act of violence before it could intervene. This wait-and-see approach had cost Rebecca her life. She had been stalked for 3 years, but Bardo hadn't broken a single law until he pulled the trigger. In 1990, fueled by the outrage over the Schaeffer murder and a series of other high-profile harassment cases in Orange County, the state of California passed the nation's first anti-stalking law. For the first time in American history, the law recognized that fear is a form of injury. The statute criminalized the willful, malicious, and repeated following or harassing of another person that creates a credible threat to their safety. It was a paradigm shift. You didn't have to wait for the knife or the gun anymore. If someone was destroying your peace of mind, if they were hunting you, they could be arrested. This law rippled across the country. Within a few years, every single state in the Union had adopted a version of the anti-stalking statute. It is no exaggeration to say that if you are a woman today who can get a restraining order against a creepy ex-boyfriend or a stranger following you, you are protected by the shield that Rebecca Schaeffer's death forged. Simultaneously, the Los Angeles Police Department recognized that they lacked the tools to handle this new category of crime. Arresting a stalker was one thing. Managing the threat was another. They created the Threat Management Unit. It was the first police division in the world dedicated solely to investigating stalking and long-term harassment. Instead of treating these cases as isolated incidents, detectives began to build profiles, track escalation patterns, and intervene before the fatal contact occurred. They brought in psychologists to work alongside detectives, creating a model that is now used by law enforcement agencies globally, including Scotland Yard and the FBI. But the biggest battle, the one that went all the way to Washington, D.C., was over the data. The revelation that Robert Bardo had obtained Rebecca's address from the DMV was a public relations nightmare for the government. It exposed a cavalier attitude toward privacy that was no longer sustainable in the information age. However, changing this was not easy. The data industry marketers, private investigators, insurance companies lobbied hard to keep the records open. They argued that access to information was essential for business. The fight was led by unlikely allies, the Screen Actors Guild, representing the terrified stars, and politicians like Senator Barbara Boxer. They argued that efficiency could not trump safety. The debate raged for years, but the image of Rebecca Schaeffer, the girl next door, who was sold out by the state, was a powerful ghost in the hearing rooms. In 1994, 5 years after the murder, Congress passed the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. This federal law prohibited the disclosure of personal information gathered by motor vehicle departments. It closed the loophole. It ended the era where your license plate was a public billboard for your home address. Today, if you walk into a DMV and ask for someone's address, you will be denied. If a private investigator wants that information, they need a subpoena or a specific lawful purpose. The Bardo maneuver is no longer possible. Rebecca's death ended the era of the accessible star. The open door was replaced by iron gates, tinted glass, and a fortress of security that defines modern celebrity. She became the silent architect of privacy laws, ensuring that while her life was cut short, the lives of others would be shielded by the very system that failed her. We see the echoes of this trauma in how modern celebrity is consumed. Today, stars share their lives on Instagram and TikTok, giving us the illusion of intimacy. We see their breakfast, their workouts, their pets, but this is a curated digital intimacy. It is a one-way mirror. They show us what they want us to see, but physically, they are more isolated than ever. They move from gated communities to private jets to VIP entrances, never touching the ground that the public walks on. The era of the girl next door is dead because no star can afford to live next door to us anymore. Rebecca Schaeffer was the last casualty of the analog age. She was the final sacrifice of a time when we believed that fame was a hug, not a target. But we must also look at the loss of art. When we talk about Rebecca, we talk about laws and gates and stalking. We often forget to talk about the work. We forget that she was 21 years old and on the cusp of greatness. Look at the actresses who rose to prominence in the early 90s. Julia Roberts, Sandra Bullock, Winona Ryder. They built careers playing the kinds of roles Rebecca was born, for women who were smart, funny, vulnerable, and real. Rebecca Schaeffer had that same rare, luminous quality. She had the comedic timing of a Lucille Ball and the dramatic depth of a Diane Keaton. Had she walked through that door and picked up the script for The Godfather Part 3, had she auditioned, had she lived, who knows what cinema would look like today? We were robbed of decades of performances. We were robbed of seeing her grow up, falter, triumph, and age. We were left with a reel of sitcom laughter and a few movie scenes frozen in time. She remains forever 21, forever smiling, forever waiting for a courier who never came. In the end, the story of Rebecca Schaeffer is a story about the death of trust. Civilization is built on a series of invisible agreements. We agree to stop at red lights. We agree not to hurt each other. We agree that when a doorbell rings, it is an invitation, not a threat. Robert John Bardo broke that agreement. He took the social contract and tore it apart with a .357 Magnum. But in the darkness of that violation, Rebecca's legacy shines with a hard, protective light. Somewhere in America right now, a woman is walking to her car in a parking garage. She notices a man following her. She feels that primal prickle of fear on the back of her neck. She calls the police, and because of Rebecca Schaeffer, the police do not laugh. They do not tell her to call back when she's hurt. They take a report. They issue a restraining order. They access a database. The system engages. Somewhere else, a private investigator is told he cannot access a driver's license record. He is stopped by a federal law that bears the invisible signature of a girl from Oregon. Rebecca Schaeffer wanted to be famous for her talent. She wanted to be remembered for her characters. Fate, in its cruel irony, decided she would be famous for her murder and remembered for her laws. It is not the legacy she chose, but it is a powerful one. She is the guardian angel of the modern age, the silent sentry standing at the gate of our privacy. The innocent girl is gone. The open door is closed, but because of her, the lock is stronger.